Imagine, if you will, a point in history where the formidable might of the British Empire, fresh from cementing its global dominance, stood toe-to-toe with a rapidly expanding United States, still bristling with post-revolutionary zeal and the fervor of manifest destiny. Not over a gold mine, not over an ideological clash, not even over the vast expanse of a continent. No, my friends, they nearly went to war, a real war, over a pig, a solitary, unremarkable, four-legged creature with an insatiable appetite for potatoes. Welcome to the bloodless yet utterly perilous pig war, a conflict so ironically named, yet so profoundly serious that it nearly plunged two of the world's most powerful nations into a devastating, avoidable bloodshed. How could a domestic animal possibly trigger an international incident of such magnitude? The answer, as is often the case in history, lies in a thorny thicket of unresolved treaties, vague geographical descriptions, and the stubborn pride of men on the edge of the world. Our story begins in the mid-19th century, in the rugged, breathtakingly beautiful waters of the Pacific Northwest. Specifically, we cast our gaze upon the San Juan Islands, an archipelago nestled between the sprawling Vancouver Island, then firmly British, and the mainland of what would become Washington State. This was a land of towering evergreens, abundant fisheries, and a strategic location that both the Americans and the British coveted. The region's sovereignty had been nominally settled by the Oregon Treaty of 1846. This treaty, designed to resolve long-standing territorial disputes, drew a clean line along the 49th parallel, from the Rocky Mountains westward to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island, and then southerly through the middle of the said channel and a Fuca Strait to the Pacific Ocean. Sounds simple, right? It was anything but. The critical flaw lay in that seemingly innocuous phrase, the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island. You see, there wasn't just one channel. There were two major contenders, Haro Strait, wider and closer to Vancouver Island, and Rosario Strait, narrower and closer to the mainland. The San Juan Islands, including the largest, San Juan Island itself, sat smack dab in the middle, a geopolitical no-man's land. If Haro Strait was the boundary, the islands were American. If Rosario Strait was the boundary, they were British. Both nations, naturally, insisted their interpretation was the correct one. This ambiguity created a fertile ground for friction. The United States, fresh from its triumphs in the Mexican-American War and invigorated by the spirit of manifest destiny, saw the entire Pacific coast as its rightful domain. American settlers, many of them rough-hewn pioneers, began to trickle into the disputed territory, emboldened by their government's implicit claim. On the other side, the British presence was primarily embodied by the venerable Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, a powerful fur trading enterprise that had, for generations, been the de facto governing authority in vast swaths of North America. The HBC had established a sheep farm, the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, on San Juan Island itself, employing a small cadre of British subjects. For them, San Juan Island was unequivocally British territory, vital for their economic interests and a symbol of their enduring imperial reach. The stage was set for a classic clash, the established, organized British commercial interest versus the individualistic, land-hungry American settler. Every stolen timber, every stray cattle, every minor infraction became a potential flashpoint. The air on San Juan Island, though often filled with the serene sounds of nature, was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable sense of unease that awaited only the slightest provocation to explode. And then, into this volatile mixture, ambled the pig. It was June 15, 1859. The morning sun had just begun to warm the scattered clearings on San Juan Island. Lyman Cutler, an American farmer and one of the island's newer residents, was meticulously tending his potato patch. Cutler was a man who had staked his claim and intended to defend it, legally or otherwise, against any perceived encroachment, whether from man or beast. His nearest neighbor, by a twist of fate, was Charles Griffin, the Irish superintendent for the Hudson's Bay Company sheep farm. Griffin owned a number of pigs, left to roam freely on the island, a common practice in those frontier days, often a source of food but also of minor skirmishes. But on this particular morning, one of Griffin's particularly portly and persistent porkers had developed an unfortunate fondness for Cutler's ripening potatoes. This wasn't the first time. The pig had been a recurring nuisance, a bristling, oinking embodiment of cross-border irritation. Cutler had tried fences, shoeing, even warnings delivered with a rising tone of frustration. But this pig, perhaps sensing the geopolitical significance of its actions, stubbornly persisted in its culinary trespass. As Cutler surveyed the latest damage to his carefully cultivated garden, a wave of exasperated fury washed over him, eclipsing any rational thought of diplomacy or international law. He grabbed his rifle. A single shot rang out, sharp and decisive across the quieter island, shattering the morning's peace. The pig, having just enjoyed its final potato, collapsed, its brief life ending abruptly in a patch of stolen vegetables. And with that single, seemingly trivial act,
A farmer's righteous anger over a ruined crop, the fuse to a potential international catastrophe was lit. The seemingly boring history of unresolved territorial disputes had just found its most improbable and most dangerous catalyst. The stage was set, not for war, but for the absurd escalations that would soon follow.
The single shot, echoing across the tranquil waters of Griffin Bay, did more than just fell a pig. It blew a hole through the delicate fabric of Anglo-American diplomacy concerning the San Juan Islands. Lyman Cutler, rifle still smoking faintly, stood over the fallen sow, a mix of grim satisfaction and perhaps a nascent pang of apprehension, now replacing his earlier rage. He had exacted his justice, but he had also, inadvertently, poked a very large, very grumpy bear. The bear in question was not an actual ursine creature, but rather a man named Charles Griffin, an Irish employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. Griffin was no mere pig farmer. He managed the company's extensive sheep ranch on the southern end of San Juan Island, and his pigs, allowed to roam freely, were integral to the enterprise. This particular pig, now rapidly cooling in Cutler's potato patch, was unequivocally Griffin's property. Griffin, a man not known for his composure when his livelihood was threatened, soon discovered the fate of his prize sow. His anger, unlike Cutler's fleeting exasperation, was a slow-burning fury that quickly ignited into a full-blown confrontation. He marched directly to Cutler's claim, demanding immediate compensation. The sum he quoted, an audacious $100, was not just for the pig itself, which was perhaps worth $10 at market, but a punitive measure, an assertion of British rights and an affront to Cutler's insolence. Cutler, however, was as stubborn as the pig he had just dispatched. He flatly refused. The pig was trespassing, he declared, reiterating his claim to self-defense and the protection of his property. More importantly, he refused on principle. To pay Griffin, and by extension the British Hudson's Bay Company, would be to acknowledge their jurisdiction over his land, his farm, and his American rights. He offered a more reasonable $10 for the pig's value, but not a penny more, and certainly not as an admission of wrongdoing. The dispute, which had begun over a potato and a pig, now simmered into a fundamental clash of national sovereignty, reduced to the personal stubbornness of two men. Griffin, infuriated by Cutler's intransigence, promptly reported the incident to his superiors at the Hudson's Bay Company. The company, ever vigilant in asserting its claims and protecting its interests in the disputed territory, saw this as more than a mere nuisance. It was a direct challenge to their authority and the British presence on the island. The local British magistrate, Paul R. Hubbs, who also happened to be a chief factor for the Hudson's Bay Company, sided predictably with Griffin. He threatened Cutler with arrest for destroying British property. This threat was the final straw for Cutler. A lone American settler confronting the organized might of the British colonial power, he knew he needed backup. He immediately appealed to the nearest American military authority, Brigadier General William S. Harney, commander of the Department of Oregon. General Harney was not a man known for his diplomatic finesse. A veteran of the Seminole and Mexican-American Wars, he was an aggressive, fiercely nationalistic officer with a deep-seated suspicion of British motives. The recent memory of the Oregon question and the lingering resentment over the unresolved San Juan boundary fueled his existing anti-British sentiments. To Harney, Cutler's plea was not a request for protection from an unruly neighbor. It was an urgent call to defend American sovereignty from British encroachment. He saw the incident as an open challenge, a deliberate test of American resolve in the disputed territory. And Harney, spoiling for a fight, was not one to back down. Without bothering to consult his superiors in Washington, D.C., and with a zeal that bordered on recklessness, Harney acted decisively. He dispatched a detachment of Company D, 9th U.S. Infantry, under the command of Captain George Pickett, to San Juan Island. Yes, that George Pickett, the very same officer who a mere 4 years later would lead the infamous Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. At this point, however, Pickett was a young, ambitious captain, eager to make his mark. With a mere 66 men, he was ordered to establish a military post on the island and, crucially, to protect American citizens and their property on San Juan Island from the Indians or any other parties. The thinly veiled reference to any other parties was clearly directed at the British. Captain Pickett landed his small force on San Juan Island on July 27, 1859, choosing a strategic bluff overlooking Griffin Bay, precisely where the Hudson's Bay Company had its main establishment. He immediately set about constructing earthworks and fortifications, planting the American flag defiantly in what the British unequivocally considered their territory. His presence was a stark, unambiguous declaration. American citizens and American claims would now be defended by American steel. The British reaction was swift and furious. Governor James Douglas of Vancouver Island, who also served as the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, was incandescent. He viewed Pickett's landing as an invasion, an audacious act of war. Within days, Douglas dispatched 3 powerful Royal Navy warships, HMS Satellite, HMS Pylades, and HMS Plumper, to San Juan Island. Their cannons, bristling with intent, were aimed squarely at Captain Pickett's hastily constructed American camp. The stage was now set for a confrontation that dwarfed the triviality of its origin. 2 great naval powers, each claiming the same remote island, were now facing each other down, their armed forces poised on the brink of conflict. Captain Pickett, massively outnumbered and outgunned by the Royal Navy's superior firepower, famously stood his ground, reportedly declaring, "We'll make a Bunker Hill of it," referencing the legendary Revolutionary War battle where outnumbered American patriots had stubbornly resisted British forces. The absurdity of a war over a pig had given way to the terrifying reality of an impending international conflict, its fate hanging precariously in the balance, a situation few could have anticipated just weeks prior.
Pickett's audacious declaration, echoing across the tranquil waters of Griffin Bay, hung heavy in the air. The sight of 3 powerful British warships, their formidable cannons unmuzzled and ready, created a tableau of imminent catastrophe. Yet, against all expectations, the order to fire never came. The immediate de-escalation of this incredibly tense standoff owes much to a surprisingly simple fact: a lack of explicit orders to initiate hostilities, and the foresight of key British officers. While Governor Douglas of British Columbia had indeed dispatched the Royal Navy to exert pressure and reclaim the island, his instructions stopped short of outright initiating armed conflict. He sought to intimidate, not necessarily to annihilate. Moreover, the British naval commanders on the scene, most notably Captain Geoffrey Hornby of HMS Tribune, who arrived shortly after the initial deployment, were bound by standing peacetime orders. Engaging in an unprovoked attack on American troops, no matter how audacious or outnumbered, without direct authorization from London, carried immense political and personal risk. The true turning point in these harrowing days came with the arrival of Rear Admiral Robert L. Baynes, the esteemed commander of the Royal Navy's Pacific Station. Baynes, a seasoned officer with decades of service, was appalled by the prospect of a war ignited by such triviality. When Douglas urged him to dislodge the Americans by force, Baynes famously and steadfastly refused. His rationale was brilliantly succinct. 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig? What an indignity! He understood that the cost of such a conflict in lives and international standing would far outweigh any claim to a remote island or satisfaction over a farmer's belligerence. Baynes' refusal to escalate saved both nations from a potentially devastating and utterly farcical war. News of the escalating crisis, with its incredible potential for international incident, had of course reached Washington, D.C. President James Buchanan, recognizing the profound danger, immediately dispatched General Winfield Scott to the Pacific Northwest. Scott, the aging but venerable commanding general of the U.S. Army, was a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, renowned not only for his military acumen but also for his exceptional diplomatic skills. His mission was crystal clear: negotiate a peaceful resolution and prevent outright war. Arriving in the Puget Sound region in October 1859, Scott wasted no time. He entered into direct and careful negotiations with Governor Douglas. Scott, ever the pragmatist, acknowledged that Captain Pickett, while demonstrating admirable bravery, had indeed overstepped his authority, driven by a fervent, if perhaps misguided, sense of national duty. To de-escalate the immediate military presence, Scott ordered the majority of Pickett's 4th Infantry away from the contested area, replacing them with a significantly smaller, more disciplined force. He then proposed a temporary joint military occupation of the island. The agreement, painstakingly hammered out between Scott and Douglas, was pragmatic and elegantly simple. Both nations would maintain a small military presence on San Juan Island. The British would establish their camp on the northern end of the island in Garrison Bay, while the Americans would occupy the southern end overlooking Griffin Bay. Neither side would attempt to assert civil jurisdiction over the island, effectively creating a demilitarized zone in terms of governance, while the larger boundary dispute would be referred to their respective governments for diplomatic resolution. This joint occupation would last for an astonishing 12 years. For over a decade, 2 potentially hostile forces, their national flags flying within sight of each other, coexisted in a remarkable state of peace. The British camp became known as English camp, and the American camp as American camp. Far from being a continuous powder keg, life on San Juan Island during this period was ironically rather mundane. Soldiers from both sides often fraternized, participating in sports, celebrating holidays together, and even engaging in friendly sailing races. Officers maintained a polite, if sometimes stiff, professional relationship, often exchanging social calls and sharing meals. The underlying border dispute, however, remained unresolved, a persistent diplomatic irritant. Finally, with the signing of the Treaty of Washington in 1871, both nations agreed to submit the lingering San Juan Island boundary dispute to international arbitration. The chosen arbitrator was an impartial third party from a major European power, Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. After a thorough review of the historical claims, maps, and treaties, the Kaiser's decision, announced in October 1872, firmly sided with the United States, confirming the American claim to the Haro Strait Channel and, crucially, to San Juan Island itself. The British troops peacefully withdrew from San Juan Island in November 1872, and the American troops followed suit in July 1874. The Pig War officially concluded.
not a single shot had been fired between the two great powers, and no human lives were lost, beyond the unfortunate pig whose demise inadvertently ignited this fascinating chapter of history. The Bloodless Pig War stands as a compelling testament to diplomatic restraint and the wisdom of leaders like Admiral Baynes and General Scott, who saw beyond immediate nationalistic fervor and the triviality of a localized dispute to prevent a potentially catastrophic international conflict. Imagine if cooler heads had not prevailed. A war over a pig could have destabilized North America, redirected vital resources from the American Civil War, which was just around the corner, and perhaps even altered the course of British imperial history. It's a bizarre footnote, perhaps, but one that profoundly shaped the Pacific Northwest and underscored the delicate dance of diplomacy between powerful nations. The boring history takeaway? Even the most insignificant incidents, when combined with national pride and geopolitical tensions, carry the potential for catastrophic consequences. The Pig War, while bloodless, offers a surprisingly compelling lesson in international relations and the enduring power of common sense in the face of sheer absurdity. And all because of one very adventurous pig named, let's just say, Uncle Sam's Dinner.